in jail for nearly 3 years for their involvement in the Coutts border blockade. The Crown once argued that they were guilty of conspiracy to murder RCMP officers. A judge found them not guilty earlier this month, but they are still in jail. Why is it that these men have been in jail for such a long time? Other criminals commit murder and they seem to be out much faster than those involved with the Coutts border blockade. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Alberta Roundup. I'm your host, Rachel Parker. Joining me today to discuss is my colleague, Isaac Lamoureax, who has been covering this case closely. Isaac, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks. Good to be here. And just to preface this, I'm not a lawyer, obviously a journalist. So to take everything I say with a grain of salt. This is definitely not legal advice.
Fair enough. So when we talk about this, let's just start by kind of explaining what this case is and how this is distinct from the Coutts 3. So, obviously following the Coutts border blockade, there was a number of charges that were laid. Something that I covered closely was the Coutts 3 that refers to Marco van Huigenbos, Alex van Herk, and George Jansen. They were three men. They were charged with mischief over $5,000. They were found guilty and they now await sentencing. That sentencing was supposed to come in July. It has been pushed to September. I've interviewed them a few times and I will have updates for you guys in later weeks and months and what's going on there. But this case that we're taking a look at, it largely refers to the Coutts 4. Now, two of the men are no longer being charged and they've already been sentenced. Isaac, why don't you break down for us who these men are and what exactly they were being charged for, the OG charges, if you will?
Yeah, Rachel. So the Coutts 4 originally consisted of Anthony Olenek, Chris Carbert, Chris Lysak, and Jerry Morin. And the latter two accepted a plea deal on lesser charges in February. So the conspiracy to commit murder charges were dropped and both of those men were released. After serving 2 years in jail, Lysak pleaded guilty to a restricted weapons charge, and Morin pleaded guilty to a conspiracy to traffic a firearm charge. Both men were handed equivalent sentences for time served in custody. So the recommendation from the prosecutors amounted to a 3-year sentence for Lysak and a 3.5-year sentence for Morin. And generally, anyone who is detained receives a credit of 1.5 days for each day served. And Morin actually spent 74 days in solitary confinement, which receives a multiplier of 3 days. So after those two took their plea deals, Carbert and Olenek remained in custody on allegations that they conspired to murder RCMP members who were policing the border protest at the Coutts International Crossing into Montana, and their trial was, at the time, scheduled for June.
So just going back to those first two who are no longer in jail, that's Christopher Lysak, that's Jeff Morin. They were both in jails and they were released in February 2024 after 723 days in jail. And you were saying, for Jeff Morin, he was in solitary confinement for 70 days and was given an extra credit. So based on the charges, first of all, that is insane. 70 days in solitary confinement. Like, most people would come out of that as a broken person. Like, that's not something that is most people can get through. Like, that would actually break you down as a person. If you think about, for myself, more extroverted as a person, I feel a little as if I've gone a couple hours without having spoken to someone else. Like, this is like true evil we are seeing here. And then they were let off eventually after pleading guilty to much lesser crimes. So when you were talking about they were given a credit, it sounds like they actually spent much more time in jail than they should have.
Yeah, and just going back to the solitary confinement part, I generally like to think that I don't mind isolation, but I'm sure anyone can imagine that 74 days in solitary confinement, even making it through that is honorable in a sense that I can almost think of very little things in the world that would be that challenging.
It reminds me a little bit of when the two Michaels were detained in China, and I know just reading some of the stories that was coming out of at the time when they were still detained, and the one Michael was saying, they took his reading glasses away and he wasn't able to read, and just how much he was struggling in that time. And I think it's hard to imagine for us, like, what that would be like, because it's just such a foreign idea of, being just totally alone. But I hope these men are okay, because it's a very traumatizing thing that's happened to them by the state, by the people that, really are in charge of protecting Canadians. And it's an absolute failure here. So let's take a look at the other two who are still in remands. We've got Olenek and we've got Carbet. They eventually were convicted of charges of mischief and a possession of a weapon, rather than the original crime of conspiracy to kill RCMP officers. They were found not guilty of that higher crime of conspiracy in early August, but they still remain in jail right now. That they were found not guilty in early August. They still remain in jail. I know that sentencing is supposed to come next week. What can we expect to see with this case? What are the latest updates to this case with these two men who still remain in remand for about now 3 years?
Yeah, so just going back to that timeline, when the trial was first set to begin in June, Olenek and Carbet had spent 840 days in remand awaiting trial. So yeah, as you said, essentially 3 years. So now the Alberta Crown prosecutors have given a notice that they intend to appeal the not guilty verdicts given to those two. As you mentioned earlier in August, the Lethbridge jury had found that they were not guilty of conspiracy to murder police officers. However, they were convicted of mischief and possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose. And Olenek was also found guilty of possessing a pipe bomb. So the two are going to face sentencing next week on August 26th, and they both still remain in custody.
So, Isaac, I know that you've been following this case closely. Like, for the general public, I feel like we haven't heard very much from these two men. Do you have any sense of how they've been doing? Have they released any public statements?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. Just yesterday on X, this was on the Andrew Levine show, I think it was, but Chris Carbert essentially called his friend Marco Van Hugenbos
Who's one
last
of the
night.
members of the Coutts 3?
Yeah, as he was on this podcast, and he just picked up the call and put it on speaker and spoke to him for like 10 minutes, which was obviously a pretty lucky and random act to happen, but it did. And the most surprising thing I want to say, just from listening to that interview quickly, was that, and they noted this on the show too, Marco did, that Carbert really sounded to be in good spirits. You know, he wasn't, you didn't hear him speak and think, wow, this guy's depressed. He actually sounded pretty good. And then he described his intentions for the upcoming week. So he said on Monday, the judge will basically determine how the jury reached the decision that they did, and then the judge will give their decision on Tuesday, and then arguments for sentencing will begin on Thursday. So that's for the lesser charges that they did get found guilty of, and then the charges will essentially be given on Friday. So they kind of talked to Chris about how he expects this to go, and he said he does expect a decision to be made by the end of this week, but also that his lawyer thinks that they might be trying to get under his skin, and he doesn't necessarily expect them to go away quietly.
Sure. I mean, understandable that he would feel that way at this point, and good to hear that he is in good spirits, because I think a lot of times when we look at legal case, it really is a situation in which people are just worn down and don't have any fight left in them, as well as the financial ability to continue fighting these charges. So we talk about that they are awaiting their sentencing that's going to come next week. Obviously, they will be given a credit for their time already served. This is a significant amount of time at this point. It's about 3 years. Did Olenek say if he's expecting that he will have to remain in jail, or is he expecting after the sentencing to come, based on the credit that he will receive for all the time already spent in jail, is he expecting to be released? Did he say anything about that?
So sorry, this was Chris Carbert, not Olenek, but he didn't mention that. But one thing that is very interesting that they talked about briefly, especially for this Alberta Roundup show, was they discussed the possibility of Danielle Smith opening an inquiry into the legal proceedings once the trial has concluded, which they are expecting to come within the week. And Carbera unsurprisingly said that he definitely supports that. He said, quote, "Most people are going to be surprised at the things that are happening in our judicial system and inside our federal agency." And then he said, quote, "I think there needs to be an inquiry because I don't want other people to go through this like I did and like Tony did and like the two other guys. To me, this has been political the whole time and a cover-up for the Emergencies Act."
How likely, I mean, you know, interesting that that was raised. I can understand why he would support that inquiry and would desire it. How likely do you think it is that Alberta Premier Danielle Smith would support such an inquiry?
I don't know. It's hard to say. And I really do think that the Coutts 4 and the Coutts 2 have had generally pretty good public support. So that might help sway Smith in deciding whether or not to open an inquiry if she deems that it would go over well in the public eye. So obviously, I'm sure many people are hoping that an inquiry is open, but it's hard to say whether or not it will. And of course, I should specify that I think it was Van Hugenbos said on the show too. He said, "Let's make sure this is an independent inquiry because obviously, when government agencies investigate government agencies, not a lot comes of it."
Sure. I would personally be surprised if the premier did support such an inquiry, given in her public comments, it seems that she's tried to sort of distance herself from this case and say that it's solely a case of the judicial system and that, her government has nothing to do with it and shouldn't have anything to do with it, based on the fact that she, was already received sort of that ethics slap on the wrist for talking to her justice minister, asking him whether prosecution of COVID-19 cases, including the Coutts border blockade, was appropriate. The ethics commissioner had found and said that that was inappropriate that she did that. And we've seen, a strong effort from her to distance herself. But I think in the context of the fact that the UCP convention is coming up in November, or the annual general meeting, more correctly, is coming up in November. If this is something that the Conservative base cares about, as you mentioned, these men, the Coutts 3 and the Coutts 4, and I guess more specifically the Coutts 2 who remain in jail, they have had a lot of public support from Conservatives. This is something that Conservatives should put pressure on ahead of the AGM, maybe even pass a motion at the AGM to say that they would like the party to support such an inquiry into this case. Isaac, just my last question for you here. Everyone's been talking about this case, a lot of speculation. A lot of people are saying this is one of the worst cases of Canadian political prosecution that they've seen. What's your take on the situation? Do you think that these men have been treated fairly by our justice system, or is this truly a case of deep-rooted and unfair and unjust political prosecution in Canada, stemming from people who were treated so poorly during the COVID-19 pandemic, Canadians who still love and respect and desire to see their civil liberties upheld? What's your take?
Yeah, I do think this whole procedure has been unjust, and not just for the Coutts 2, the Coutts 3, the Coutts 4, but also, of course, Tamara Leach and Chris Barber. And I mean, the list goes on, as people who know that those who protested, let's say, or against the pandemic measures have not been treated fairly. Those who have decided not to get vaccines or have been injured from the vaccines have not necessarily been treated fairly. I mean, the list goes on. We could be here all day speaking about the unfairness of the pandemic and the subsequent legal proceedings. I do have a few quotes here from when independent journalist Mocha Bezergan, he was outside of the Coutts hearing, and he talked to a few people, one of whom was a retired federal correctional officer who said that she had been, quote, responsible for the incarceration of some of Canada's most notorious criminals. And then she went on to liken the ordeal of the Coutts 4 to, quote, torture. She said, quote, "I still don't believe people should be tortured in our country, and I really believe that's what the men are experiencing in remand for 2.5 years is torture, torturous." I have lots of quotes I could go through here, but I mean, look, there's no, yeah, no, it has been a judicial injustice, and I do think that if any inquiry were to occur that was a fair inquiry and an independent inquiry, it would definitely show injustice at levels that I think most people don't even want to begin to think is possible in Canada and Alberta.
I mean, I think just to put it into context, like anyone who's paying attention is concerned with what's going on in our justice system. Seems every week, if not every day, we get a news story about someone who committed a stabbing or was involved in a shooting that, was already released on bail. And these men, they were not eligible for bail. I pulled some numbers here. Just from the last few years. In 2017, a man was given 3 years for killing 3 teens. He was only given 3 years in jail. These men have been in jail for about 3 years and they didn't kill anyone. In 2021, a man was given 8 years for killing 4 people. 2023, 5 years for killing 2 children. Like, these numbers just don't add up. Why are these men being treated with such hostility by our justice system? And people who have actually committed murder are honestly given a slap on the wrist. Like, these should have all been back-to-back life sentence for every life that was taken. So it is very disheartening to see. Isaac, thank you so much for kind of breaking this down for us. I know that we'll be eager to watch your coverage next week of the next steps in this case. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insight with our viewers today.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. I appreciate it.
All right, everyone, that's all we have time for today on the Alberta Roundup. Don't forget to check our website, tnc.news, this week for the updates on that case. Isaac will have all the details for you. I hope that you guys have a great rest of your weekend. I will see you next week with some more Alberta coverage. God bless.